I wish to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging, and thank them for all that they have done and do in caring for country. This is unceded land, and as the recently released Europe Justice Commission report, Australia's first formal truth-telling inquiry into historic and ongoing systemic injustices perpetrated against First Peoples through colonisation, explains there is a lot to do to address past and present-day wrongs. In NAIDOC Week, which is this week, in which we celebrate Australia's First Nations people, their cultures and resilience, it is important to not only acknowledge we are on unceded lands, but that we all have some work to do. For me, the focus of this conference, framed as the problem of noise in our communication systems, is very germane to the work we, as scholars in the humanities and social sciences, are engaged in. The original idea in Shannon and Weaver's theory that noise interrupted the smooth flow of signals within a communication system has been critiqued from many viewpoints, not least that communication is not simply a linear line, that audiences make their own meanings and do not necessarily interpret the message as intended by the sender, regardless of noise in the transmission line. In part, this is because signals, essential for communication and sociality, only make meaning in their cultural context if their cultural context is shared and understood. This means that the first thing we need to do is to discern whether something is a signal or a noise, as the call for papers for this conference rightly points out. In the cacophony of contemporary life, where both signals and noises are simply overwhelming, this is a harder task than ever. Your proposition that noise may contain within it other ways of thinking that are indeed signals for an alternative set of values and ways of life, rather than necessarily being a problem, is a refreshing one, for noise does indeed carry a bad connotation to it. But I also want to introduce two other terms to your deliberations, and those terms are silence and listening. Noises, as well as being potential signals, are also sounds. They include silence, which is part of our sonic landscape. If you have ever played a musical instrument or are in the practice of listening to music intently, you will know that silence, or in musical notation, rests or pauses, are as important as the notes. They help to shape the songline and the emotional landscape of the piece. They are part of the dramatic mise-en-scène. In music, silence is also what encourages intensive listening, because you are expecting something else to come after or curious about what comes next. Silences can provide the space to become open to possibilities, that is, to listening. Listening is, of course, what we all need to do to be able to be open to difference. Paying attention to silences within the noise that surrounds us is perhaps just as important as interpreting whether any given noise is a problem or a signal. Silences also give us the time to listen and reflect, to open up, and to listen more carefully, thus being open to the possibility that some noises may indeed be signals. So while I firmly believe we need to do a lot more listening, I hope that over the next 2 days, as you discuss the complex relations between noises and signals and open up the transformative powers of noise, you also make space to listen to one another and pay attention not just to noise, but to silences, as becoming better listeners is integral to the problems I know you will be discussing. And becoming better listeners is also what we need to do to filter bad noise from good noises in understanding the signals and hopes that the Europe Justice Commission report has just delivered us. So I hope the next 2 days bear fruitful conversations, establish new friendships, open up exciting possibilities for new research endeavours, and shine some light on the many problems our world is currently facing in the hope of indeed making it a better place. Have fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea, for that beautiful opening. I'll now hand over to Mardi Reardon-Smith, who's going to chair our keynote session.
Thanks, Sophie. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the keynote today. I want to echo my colleagues' acknowledgement of country. We're lucky to be meeting here today on unceded Aboriginal land. We're very lucky to be joined today by Associate Professor Elizabeth Stevens, who will be delivering the keynote, and Dr. Jaya Keaney, who will be acting as a respondent. We'll hear from both Elizabeth and Jaya, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end as well. Associate Professor Elizabeth Stevens is a Director of Research and Associate Professor of Cultural Studies in the School of Communication and Art at the University of Queensland. Her publications include the monographs A Critical Genealogy of Normality, co-authored with Peter Kreil, and Anatomy as Spectacle, Public Exhibitions of the Body from 1700 to the Present, and the forthcoming Artificial Life, co-authored with Oren Katz, Sarah Collins, and Ayanat Sir. Her recent Future Fellowship examined the genealogy of experimental bodies produced by a biomedical imaginary since the emergence of modern biology and medicine. She's the founder and convener of the Australasian Health and Medical Humanities Network, the co-editor of Australian Feminist Studies, and immediate past president of the Cultural Studies Association of Australasia. And our respondent, Dr. Jaya Keaney, is a lecturer in gender studies at the School of Social and Political Sciences at Melbourne University. She writes, researches, and teaches in the fields of feminist technoscience studies, queer and feminist theory, and critical theories of race. Her research across these fields explores reproduction, racism, and queer feminist frameworks of embodiment and inheritance. And Jaya is the author of Making Gabies, Queer Reproduction and Multiracial Feeling. So I'll welcome Elizabeth up to the stage.
Super. Thank you so much for that nice introduction. And what a fantastic first day we had at the conference yesterday. I'm so grateful to the invitation, particularly Chris O'Neill, who invited me to be here today, but to all the organising team of this conference are doing a bang-up job. It was a really great start yesterday. And to be continued. Let's give them a round of applause. Thanks, guys. We all know how much work it is. So we're going to keep to time today, so I'm going to dive straight in. I really appreciate the acknowledgements of country that we began with and the reference to silence as well, because my presentation today is about a history that hasn't been told, so it's very resonant with that theme. So, one of the most popular and long-running attractions at the Coney Island Amusement Park during the first half of the 20th century was an exhibition of infant incubators run by a Dr. Martin Cooney. And I apologise in advance because I'm going to be saying Coney Island and Cooney throughout this paper. I acknowledge that that is tricky, but anyway, bear with me. And furnished, as the advertising banners proclaimed, with live babies. Here they are on the boardwalk. The babies in question were very premature newborns, generally weighing between 2 and 3 pounds on arrival, who were put on public display inside the then new and experimental technology of the neonatal incubator as part of a commercial sideshow that opened every summer season at Coney Island from 1903 through to 1943. This is what it looked like inside. While other popular entertainments featuring displays of living people that neighboured this exhibition gradually fell from public favour and closed during the first decades of the 20th century, Cooney's exhibitions of babies in incubators actually gained in reputation and standing over this time. Here he is in the 1930s, standing in front of his sideshow. While other sideshows featured displays of human bodies and spectacularised their difference, the incubator babies represented a spectacle of normalisation and successful medical intervention. At a time when the mortality rate for babies born under 3 pounds was as high as 90%, Cooney claimed to have saved over 80% of the 8,000 babies who passed through his care over the 45 years that he remained in business. I say claimed because, of course, there are no medical records for Coney Island, but it is important to know, in terms of silencers, that not a single complaint was made over the 45-year period, including by the parents of the babies who were in the sideshow. Despite the wide evidence of the incubator's success, however, incubators were not introduced into the American hospital system until, the US hospital system, until the middle of the 20th century. The first neonatal ward using incubators opened in New York in 1943, which is when Cooney decided to close his facility at Coney Island. Remarkably then, for most of the 40 years that he remained in business, some of the best medical care and highest survival rates for premature babies in the United States were to be found inside a public neonatal ward located inside an amusement park. So what are we to make of this strange historical episode? How is it considered not just okay, but positively uplifting to exhibit medically vulnerable newborns as part of a commercial sideshow as recently as the 1940s? Functioning simultaneously as a sideshow attraction, a public health exhibition, and a neonatal ward, here's his business card. It's scientific, educational, and inspirational at the same time. Cooney's facility at Coney Island, I will argue in this presentation, tells us something important about the history of neonatal medical treatment and the development of neonatal medical technology, although they're rarely considered as part of this history. If they're acknowledged at all, it's usually as a curious footnote within this history of paediatrics. The history of public incubator baby shows, I will argue in this presentation, is a noisy history. Literally noisy, in that it was tucked in behind the rides and the sideshows and the roller coasters of Coney Island, but also noisy in the figurative sense evoked by the theme of this conference. They complicate the way the history of neonatal incubation for premature infants has been told in the history of medicine. And they allow us to make sense of an otherwise silent dynamic within that history, such as why hospitals in the USA took so long to introduce incubators despite the very high mortality rate for premature babies. The mainstream history of neonatal medical technology is filled with silencers whose significance these strange sideshows help articulate. In the book from which this material is drawn, which as Mardi explained, is on the history of experimentation as something that moves between the arts and sciences, I've identified a series of odd and obscure episodes like this, and my approach is to take their strangeness seriously. Like noise, strangeness is indicative of a disruption to the way that things are usually understood, and they help us recognise dynamics and assumptions that often pass unsaid. It is the meaning and unexpected impact of popular incubator baby shows that I want to share with you in this presentation. So as unique as they may seem, in fact, Cooney's exhibitions had their origins in an even lesser known incubator exhibitions that began in France at the end of the 19th century. These were staged by a now largely forgotten inventor and medical entrepreneur, Alexandre Lion. who's an obscure figure who left behind hardly any historical trace. In the few historical references to him, Leon is usually identified as a doctor, but there's no record that he overwrote a medical thesis, which is a requirement in France to become a doctor, and it's much more likely that he was an inventor and an entrepreneur. According to municipal records, he was born in the south of France in 1861, the son of a poultry farmer. Now, this is significant, as I will come back to. In 1889, he submitted his patent for the first infant incubator. But in the 1880s, incubators existed only for poultry. They played a pivotal role, in fact, a very fascinating one, in the history of industrial food production. And so these are some early 20th examples of what those incubators look like. In 1890, just a year after he invented the baby incubator, a collective of government agencies in the south of France provided Leon with 3 years of funding to test the use of his incubator, and he opened a charitable institution in Nice. We can assume most of the babies were probably from poorer homes, brought in desperation, but there's no record of their origin. The medical inspector who oversaw the protection of children in Nice wrote a detailed report at the end of the 3 years, in which he noted that Leon's maternity received over 185 premature babies, most under 2 kilograms on arrival, and the survival rate was 75%. Most of the babies who passed away weighed under 1 kilo on admittance, and that's still a very dangerously low weight. So in 1894, when the public funding seems to have come to an end, Lyon opened what was essentially a pop-up branch of the Maternity Lyon at their 1984 World's Fair in Lyon. Lyon. Yeah. What's going on? At which he exhibited his incubators with premature babies inside and gave lectures on neonatal care to the audience. Press coverage reveals that the reception of these exhibitions and the incubator itself and the terms in which these took place, they noted that the Lyon incubator could save up to 80% of the 200,000 premature and underweight babies who died each year in France. And one article stated, "We are inconsolable at the loss of all these little beings who are unable to overcome their weakness at birth." And they concluded, "It is our future soldiers we see in these glass sentry boxes." The life-saving capacity of the Lyon incubator, especially its often cited ability to ensure a continuous population of French soldiers industrially produced like incubated chickens, meant that it earned uniformly positive coverage in the popular and medical press as Lyon hit the World's Fair in the mid-1890s. The survival rate at his exhibitions was around 85%, and for home and hospital premature births, it was around 10%. Between 1894 and 1913, when he staged his last exhibition at the Ghent World's Fair, he participated in 21 of these World's Fairs. This is his most famous one. It was at the Great Industrial Exposition in Berlin in 1896, and more than 250,000 people turned up to see it. Here we see an illustration from a popular magazine featuring curious, well-dressed onlookers, lots of women as well, gathered around what was described as the latest novelty, an artificial foster mother. As we will see further below, Lyon's incubator exhibitions promoted a newly technologised vision of childbirth in which biological mothers would be replaced by artificial mothers, female midwives would be replaced by male paediatricians, and births would take place in hospital wards rather than at home. We can also think of the externalisation as well that's happening here. The maternal body would become the noise in a newly efficient and technologised understanding of neonatal care, tied in complex ways to ideas about colonisation, nationalisation, and empire building. Lyon received the gold medal for medical and surgical displays at this fair, and prominent health officials called for the introduction of his incubator into hospitals and private maternity homes to combat depopulation, which was a major concern at the end of the 1900s in Europe. Medical journals publicised and celebrated his invention. Yet his Children's Incubation Institute, as he called it, was located not inside the halls of science or industry, next to the world's largest telescope or the first publicly exhibited X-ray, which were inside those halls, but rather on the midway between, which is the entertainment area of the fair, between a village of Indigenous people and a group of Tyrolean yodelers. Like the exoticized bodies exhibited around them, these babies were sometimes perceived as less than fully human. They do not appear able to see or hear, this article said, but merely to exist. Their dependence on a machine to sustain them was particularly a subject of curiosity. This is attributable in part to the cultural status of the incubator itself at this time, associated as it was with an agricultural technology rather than a medical one. This association was so strong that this exhibition here in Berlin was referred to as the baby hatchery in the press. It's also reflected in the ticket for the 1900 World's Fair, held a few years later, in which we see a sleeping baby surrounded by a hen and chickens, and these figures are standing in for a technology that doesn't need to be shown to the audience of the day. But I put it to you that this image does not make sense visually to a contemporary audience. We would not know how to read this. The very word for incubator in French is couveuse d'enfants. Recalls this association. A couveuse is a breeding hen and a couveuse artificielle is a bird incubator. Early responses to the baby incubator reflected the possibility that the babies being raised inside might also be partly artificial, hatched for the good of the nation. And we can compare this to 20th century rhetoric surrounding like test tube babies, for instance. There's a constancy there. So even as Lyon's promotional materials, like this one, acknowledge the incubator's agricultural origins, his exhibitions played a key role in changing that association of the incubator and its place in the cultural imaginary. In 1896, he opened a more permanent facility in Paris, located on the Boulevard Poissonnière, which, for those of you who don't know, is the heart of Paris's entertainment district. Now, note this poster is in the Art Nouveau style, which again, visually is synonymous in the early 20th century with progress and industrial modernity. And I would invite you to please notice the bizarre babies' heads that are on top of the vine there. That's a very classic sign of Art Nouveau style. This poster and exhibition also inspired one of the world's first female film directors, Alice Guy Blanchet, who made a short film using with like cabbages with babies inside them from 1901. It's like, you can see it on YouTube. It's absolutely amazing. Currently, this is what it looks like. It looked like on the left, you can see how it was advertised in its own period. And then the photo on the right, I took last week, and today it's a hair salon. So at this place, what we saw was a novel combination of a public health exhibition and a functioning neonatal ward. And here, Lyon developed a new business model. Here's the admittance card. His facility would provide free care for premature babies from poorer families, and he'd cover the significant operating costs by selling tickets to the public. By promoting his maternity as both a site for public education about neonatal care and a functioning neonatal unit, Lyon represented and consolidated a social shift in pregnancy and maternity care that was already underway at this time, as childbirth moved from the private sphere of the home into the institutional space of the hospital. This shift had been hailed already in an early article on the incubator in the Scientific American, in which the incubator was celebrated as a technological replacement for a maternal body that had become, I quote, anemic and jaded. So the urban maternal body becomes anemic and jaded, and then the industrial incubator takes its place. It's not to, I quote, the exceptionally devoted care of the mother that the safety of these delicate existences is confided, the author claimed, as the sitting hen, often interferes with the hatching of her heads by too much solicitude. So the most loving and attentive mother in this case would certainly prove more prejudicial than useful to her nursling. In place of the inadequate biological mother, the article continued, there is advantageously substituted for her what is known as the artificial mother. Through the glass in the cover, the mother, I'm still quoting, the mother has every opportunity of watching the growth of her newborn babe, but that is all she is allowed to do. Mothers would no longer be understood as primary caregivers, but relegated to a passive role. Technology would substitute for the failing biological body. Lyon's Incubator exhibition spectacularised and consolidated these cultural changes. His incubator was widely praised for its level of automation. So the medical journal The Lancet, one of the most prestigious journals in the field, said the main feature of this new incubator is the fact that it requires no constant and skilled care. It works automatically. The only attendance necessary is that needed for the feeding and the washing of the infant. Now, as you can see on this slide here, that's not true. As usual, rhetorics around automation are actually underpinned by extensive human labour that's invisibilised by the claims that they're operating automagically. Technicians were needed constantly to maintain the incubators. Nurses were needed to supervise the babies within. Physicians were there to oversee their treatment. Regardless, the Lyon Incubator was soon the most successful and widely used model of its time. Now, I mention this because this is not the standard history of the incubator. Lyon is rarely credited with its invention, and its design and development is not traced through the sphere of public exhibitions. Instead, its invention is attributed to a very eminent French obstetrician, Stéphane Tanier, and its development is traced through the French hospital system. Here's Tanier's. Now, you can see here the Tanier's design is actually quite different. It's more like the earlier warming tubs that were used in previous generations. It's a low wooden box heated by hot water bottles. It's a simpler and less technological design than Lyon's, and it was more obviously resembled a poultry incubator. And you can see that if you see them, that's a poultry incubator there. You can see they're a very similar design. In his foundational text in paediatrics, the nursling, I'm going to call it, Tanier's student Pierre Boudin noted that while his reader may have seen, I quote, the Lyon incubators exhibited on a Paris boulevard, he said this model was too expensive to be used in a hospital setting where its technological complexity increased the likelihood of malfunction. He wasn't wrong on that, by the way. By using his incubators, though, in public exhibitions, Lyon was able to disprove this argument by showing that they worked in public, demonstrating that they could be used reliably and safely, even in the space of a pop-up exhibition. Lyon held an exhibition at the Paris Expo, the one I showed you the ticket for, in 1900, which is the same year that Boudin published his book denouncing his exhibitions. This version, as you can see, is made almost entirely of glass, and the gas bottle is hidden underneath. If we see them side by side, we can see how different the designs are. Whereas the Lyon Tanier's incubator is a low wooden box designed to be viewed from above by the nurses in hospitals, Lyon's incubator is placed on legs and it's at eye height to the spectators. Its design was shaped by the context of exhibitions in which it was developed. It was intended to maximise visibility, to function both as a visual technology and as a medical technology. While Tanier, however, was one of the most renowned obstetricians and paediatricians of his day and had the support of the equally eminent Boudin, Lyon was an obscure provincial inventor. Yet it's Lyon's incubator that was recognised professionally and popularly as the more advanced and successful design. A report by one local physician on Lyon's exhibition at the Geneva World's Fair in 1896 directly compared the Tanier and the Lyon models and concluded that the Lyon incubator will render the previous heavy wood and glass incubator obsolete. He called it an antique system of hot water bottles in a wooden box. And Lyon's design, this is the main design that he used. His design also looked more modern and it was more aesthetically pleasing. The Lancet praised the design for its bright and cheerful appearance and its silvered tubes, noting that it was altogether a pleasant as well as an interesting sight. So my point is that the infant incubator had two distinct but interwoven paths of development in France. One was official and institutional. It's located in the hospital system. It's carefully documented, and those documents are in preserved archives. The other was popular and exhibitory. And it was located in places of commerce and entertainment, and thus has been largely forgotten. It was the latter, however, that had the greater impact on the design of the modern incubator and the technologisation of neonatal care in the early 1900s. Prompted by widespread concerns about depopulation in Europe, incubators in Europe moved quite quickly into hospital use, because World's Fairs are also trade shows. They're not just sites of exhibition. And you can follow the implementation of incubators in hospitals by following Lyon's itinerary on the World's Fair around Europe. And so by the 1910s, incubators were in relatively widespread use in Europe, and Lyon soon stopped exhibiting. The success of his enterprise inevitably attracted imitators, however, amongst them Martin Cooney, to whose story we will now return in the second half of the paper. So the year following Lyon's celebrated exhibition in Berlin, Martin Cooney opened an identical exhibition with his business partner, Samuel Schenken, at the 97 Victoria World's Exhibition in London, using Lyon incubators distributed and displayed under the name of their licensed manufacturer, Paul Altman. As you can see, it's a direct copy of the Lyon exhibitions, and like Lyon's before it, it was hailed as one of the highlights of the fair. Over 200,000 visitors came, many of them famous, and it received very positive reviews in journals like The Lancet. The same year, a different exhibition was opened in New York by a non-profit organisation calling itself the Lyon Institute. And this is it here. You can see it had a strikingly different ambience. There's ornamental ferns, which are very representative of exoticism at the time, another visual sign. There's a central seating area where visitors could relax. This is what it looks like inside. You can see there are ferns in between the incubators. Reactions to this exhibition, however, were much more mixed than Lyon's exhibitions in Europe, where European medical professionals saw the premature babies on display as future citizens and soldiers. The editors in their American counterparts often saw them as weak and debilitated. The editors of the Western and Surgical Medical Gazette compared this exhibition to a freak show. They said, "Thus does the Dye Museum come in touch with the scientific world." It described the babies as sad accidents, weakened, shriveled. That's a quote. This association of infant incubators exhibitions with Dye Museum shows and babies with accidents of birth is not found in the reviews of Lyon's exhibitions in Europe. It's one that only appears when they move to the USA. The following year, Cooney and Schenken themselves relocated to the States, and Cooney seized the opportunity to reinvent his identity. In interviews, like this one, he provided a largely fictitious biography of his background in which he claimed to be a former student of Pierre Boudin's and the exhibitor of the incubators at the Great Industrial Expo in Berlin. He also claimed to be a paediatrician and to have invented the incubator he was exhibiting, as he does in this interview. This account actually continues to be repeated in a small body of literature available on these exhibitions today, but none of it's true. Cooney was born Martin Cohen in Poland in 1869, and his emigration records list him as a merchant. There's no record he ever completed any of his medical training, and changing his name to Keaney also disguised his Jewishness, which he never publicly acknowledged. Infant incubators would prove as popular in the United States as they had been in Europe, and as successful in saving the lives of the baby inside them. And yet Keaney and Schenker had far less success in selling incubators to local doctors and hospitals than Lyon had in Europe. Their exhibitions continued to be located on the midway or the entertainment zones of the fair. So here's the first American one. And then, sorry, no, this is the second one. They exhibited at the Pan American World's Fair in Buffalo, in New York in 1901. And this one was a success as big as the ones that had happened in London and Berlin. This is what it looked like inside. One newspaper report described it as the first exposition where babies have been raised in an incubator like a chicken. This exhibition, however, incorporated new elements from popular fair cultures not seen before. There were barkers or touts used outside the exhibit to encourage people to come inside, and a set of premature triplets was advertised as a special attraction. 48 of the 50 babies exhibited at this exhibition survived. By comparison, there was an attempt to use an American design incubator in a New York hospital the previous year, and that resulted in the deaths of all but 2 of the 73 infants who were admitted. But not everyone agreed that the high success rate at this exhibition was cause for celebration. The Buffalo Inquiry, for instance, cautioned whether this form of life-giving will improve the race is a matter of dispute. This perspective is not found in responses to Lyon's exhibitions in Europe. It's specific to the USA. These tensions were exacerbated when a competing showman staged an exhibition at the Louisiana Purchase Exhibition World's Fair in 1904. Keaney was not involved in this one, and my guess is that he lost the tender for it, because you had to tender to have these exhibitions. The exhibition in 1904, half the babies soon died from a spreading infection, and a local paediatrician, John Zahorsky, was brought in to supervise their medical care afterwards. He published a report the following year called Baby Incubators, a clinical study of the premature infant with a special reference to incubator institutions conducted for show purposes. And he noted in this that the feeling, I'm quoting, the feeling of the medical profession is against the show incubators because it's degrading, he said, to human sentiment to make an exhibition out of human misfortune, especially in the shape of tiny infants. Zahorsky denied accusations that the mortality rate, on the other hand, had been particularly high, because a 50% survival rate was still higher than in that of most hospital wards. But he concluded, like Boudin, that while incubators were probably effective in saving lives, their exorbitant costs and the dangers of infectious outbreaks, which was called hospitalism at the time, made their use in neonatal wards impractical. Unlike Europe then, the incubators would not move speedily into the hospital system in the USA, but rather encounter trenchant resistance from the medical profession. Histories of neonatal medicine and medical technology are silent on the long delay introducing incubators to the American hospital system, and it's often hard to recover why something didn't happen historically. But Keaney's noisy experiments give voice to that silence and what was driving it. You might have already picked up a theme in this, but I'm going to make it explicit. The same year that the Louisiana Purchase Exhibition was held, and probably, as I said, because he lost the tender, Keaney accepted an invitation to open an infant incubator pavilion at the new Luna Park at Coney Island. And there he would remain for the next 40 years. This is an early advertisement for it, nestled amongst the roller coasters and the sideshows. Schenken appears to have stopped exhibiting with Keaney at this time, although he did remain Keaney's business partner. While the move to Coney Island might seem like a significant shift from the more refined circles of the World's Fair, which were considered very prestigious, to a much coarser, more fairground space, we should remember that when Coney Island first opened, and this is an early image, its reputation was not that of a seedy carnival, but rather a modern pleasure palace filled with new and experimental technologies, and that includes the electric lighting that you can see here. You might know it's one of the first places in the USA to have electric lighting. So the baby incubators are in fact consistent with that. Now, a popular review in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, just after the show opened, acknowledged that the location of Cooney's infant incubator exhibit might seem, I quote, questionable, almost repellent, due to its, quote, strong flavour of incongruity and inappropriateness. But the newspaper nonetheless concluded that Cooney's facility was a sober scientific exhibition and not one designed to appeal to the curious or vulgar. Although our rather yokily designed friend here with his hat on shows the mix of audience that we might have had for them. The fact that Cooney also offered free access to the incubators and medical care for the babies further mitigated the perception with the public that he was financially profiteering off the misfortune of premature babies and allowed him to present his fertility as a charitable institution. Nonetheless, during here's an early promotional parade, during his first decade at Coney Island, Cooney continued to try and sell his incubators rather than simply exhibit them. And my feeling is that's actually what he was intending to do. That was his original purpose. In 1905, he formed the Infant Incubator Company with Schenken and a Dr. Fischel, who had referred babies to him at the Pan American Expo that I showed earlier, and another person. However, sales to hospitals remained so low that the company began advertising directly to amusement parks, and you can see that on the advertisement here. And soon there were exhibits of babies in incubators at a whole range of dime museums in Philadelphia, in Buffalo, in Denver. There are others. Here's an example. I need a mouthful of water, so let me just leave you for a second so you can enjoy the spectacle. So, Cooney's own advertising banners, which read "Infant Incubators with Live Babies," actually echoed the "It's Alive" slogan that you would see in a lot of commercial dime museums and professional freak shows used to advertise the exhibits of people with unusual bodies at the time. So the balancing act that Cooney would perform over the 40 years he remained at Coney Island was a delicate one. While Coney Island provided Cooney with a commercial base for his incubator shows, exhibiting at World's Fairs ensured their ongoing respectability. And so he accordingly continued to participate in those throughout his career. He used the proceedings from Coney Island to underwrite lavish exhibitions at the 1933 Century of Progress Exposition at Chicago, which was the highlight of his public recognition. This exhibition was held in collaboration with one of the founders of pediatrics in the USA, Julian Hess, who acknowledged that he had studied with Cooney at Coney Island in his premature and congenitally diseased infants, which was the first North American textbook on premature babies. Cooney also staged his last major World's Fair exposition at the 1939 World's Fair, which left him virtually bankrupt. It was the Depression, of course, during this period. But my point about this is that it's actually remarkable that infant incubator exhibits were being still accepted and presented at World's Fairs as late as the 1930s, 50 years after their inception, because the purpose of World's Fairs is to showcase new technologies and cutting-edge inventions. And at this stage, by this time, the incubators are far from new. The patent on the incubator is 50 years old. Yet reports in the popular press as late as the 1930s referred to the infant incubators as though they were new, describing them in terms that closely resembled that of the Scientific American article that I showed you earlier. So here's one from the popular journal Mechanical Marvels and Inventions from 1931, which announced the arrival not of the artificial mother, but the robot mother, because the word robot's just been invented in the 1920s. Unbelievable as it may sound, the article said, Dr. Keaney's incubator machine actually serves as a substitute for the mother in the crucial stages of the baby's life. And they noted, amongst other things, they drew a direct connection between its function as a medical and a display technology, describing the incubator as a showcase lodged on a base. So if Keaney's exhibitions in Chicago and World's Fair were the largest and most celebrated of his career, it's a reflection not of the novelty of the incubator as a new technology, but rather of its changing cultural status, as well as that of the babies inside it. There's no actual category of premature babies at this time, by the way. There's only weaklings and debilitated babies. At the Chicago World's Fair, the incubator baby exhibit was again located on the Midway, next to the famous fan dancer, Sally Rand. And inside the halls of science and medicine, on the other hand, could be found an exhibition like this one. This one's from London because I couldn't find an image of the actual exhibition, but it's modelled on this. And it was sponsored by the American Public Health Association, and it was called Eugenics in New Germany, 1933, guys. The exhibition was curated by Harry Laughlin, who was the Assistant Director of Cold Springs Eugenic Record Office, who had recently drafted a model eugenic sterilisation law that became a template for a series of local sterilisation laws enacted throughout the United States. And indeed, it's the model of the laws that Germany used as well. He was very celebrated in Germany. His exhibition in Chicago displayed a series of posters warning on, this is an actual poster, warning about the dangers of racial degeneration, explained in terms of genetic inheritance. Now, it was this thinking, I put it to you, that fueled the widespread medical belief that babies born prematurely or underweight, or as they were called, debilitated, would never grow into healthy adults. Feebleness, the other term for it, of premature babies was seen as a congenital condition that would make those babies dependent on care and medical support for the rest of their lives. It's worth remembering at this juncture that Keaney was Jewish, and during the 1930s, he was spending a considerable portion of his Coney Island income bringing his extended family from Europe to the USA. So a comparative study of the ethics of mainstream medical profession at this time and the fake fairground doctor does not cast the former in a particularly flattering light. Whereas French doctors at the end of the 19th century had been concerned about depopulation and wanted a generation of produced soldiers, their counterparts in the United States were primarily concerned about degeneration. Just as Lyon had used his exhibitions to demonstrate the safety and reliability of his incubator in the face of criticism from the well-respected medical authority Boudin, so Keaney used his exhibition to prove that the premature babies could grow into healthy and normally developed children. He did this in part by graduating, as he said, a number of healthy babies from Coney Island each year, and then he would stage regular homecoming ceremonies for them. So the babies could go back and people would see there were articles about this, it was on the radio, and people could see that the children had grown into healthy babies. After World War I, he held a special homecoming ceremony for former incubator babies who had gone on to become soldiers in the war, thereby making explicit their contribution and service to their country. Keaney's own daughter, Hildegard, here she is, was born prematurely in 1907, and she spent her first months in an incubator at Coney Island, and she grew up to become a nurse, and she worked with her father at Coney Island and at other facilities, including at the New York World's Fair. So by way of conclusion, it's worth noting that these exhibitions took place and in a context in which baby shows of healthy babies were also very popular in the United States. And these shows were called Better Baby competitions, and they awarded prizes for the fattest baby, the cutest baby, the most active baby, and so forth. Here's some advertisements for them. Better Baby shows were often organised by local eugenics associations, and they employed physicians and nurses to judge the babies according to, I quote, strict standards of bodily measurement, physical development and mental development. And you can see like one of the babies being measured on those signs. Like the infant incubator exhibitions, Better Baby shows popularised the medicalisation of childcare, but they did so in a way that emphasised the eugenic value of those babies, their good genes. Cooney's exhibitions, on the other hand, you can see the similarity, showed that the incubator could improve the health of babies born weak or debilitated. His exhibitions prove that the line between a debilitated and healthy babies was not fixed at birth, against the conviction of the medical profession. In an interview with The New Yorker during the 1939 World's Fair, he emphasised, "All my life I have been making propaganda for the proper care of preemies, who in other times were allowed to die." His former babies, many of whom were now grown, were all good, normal, respectable people, he insisted. He wrote, "I've never had a letter from someone from hospital, from prison." The babies themselves were extremely grateful and also said they would have been allowed to die otherwise. And one of them visited Coney at Coney Island every year for Father's Day for the rest of his life. So in this context, Cooney's famous slogan, "All the world loves a baby," which you can see on the sign there, must be understood not as the simple expression of an existing platitude of the time, but rather as a new imperative, an attempt to conjure that sentiment into being. Over the 45 years he remained in business, Cooney's incubator shows did more than save the lives of hundreds of thousands of individual premature babies. They also did much to establish the value of those lives and their right to be saved. The noisy history of his exhibitions sheds new light on the slow adoption of the incubator in the US hospital system by making visible the otherwise hidden cultural dynamics that confined its use to the space of an amusement park, allowing Cooney, the failed incubator salesman and fake doctor, to run the longest and most successful medical experiment ever conducted in public. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. What a fascinating history. I think there'll be a lot for all of us to chew over. I now welcome Jaya Keaney to the podium to give her response.
If I may, I've forgotten my obligations to my funding association.
All right, thank you so much, Elizabeth. I love that paper. I just want to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nations on whose lands we're meeting, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Anti-colonialism is an international practice of interconnected struggle, and I stand in solidarity with ongoing Indigenous resistance to colonial occupation on these lands and elsewhere in the world. So I want to thank Elizabeth for that knockout paper, and also Mardi for chairing the session, and Chris and Karina for all of the incredible work you've done to put together this conference and for the invitation to respond today. The discussant talk is increasingly one of my favourite academic genres. I think because of how it can kind of model thinking in communion, thinking in process as a vital part of intellectual life, but also it can sometimes escape a little bit some of the clutches of valuation, and of accounting in the corporate university. So it's particularly nice to have the chance to respond to your talk, Elizabeth. And it sparked so many thoughts for me about the relationships between science and spectacle, innovation and expertise, and also the history of reproduction and reproductive technoscience as a rather queer history of spectacle and artifice. So this paper and the wonderful article from which it draws, which I recommend everybody goes and reads, really deepens a theme central to Elizabeth's influential broader corpus of work, that of the lively, kind of promiscuous relationships between visual and biomedical technologies and modes of perception, phrased at times as art and science, those supposed epistemological and cultural strangers. Here, as we've heard in this talk, she tells a rich and at times like utterly gobsmacking tale. I was like, my mouth was agape reading the article repeatedly. I had to like take a break. And so this tale that of how exhibits of neonatal incubators at world's fairs, at public exhibitions, at Coney Island play this crucial role in the reformulation of maternal and neonatal care practices and also subjects in late 19th and early 20th century Europe and North America. So far from this peripheral footnote to a properly credentialed medical history, these public exhibits by Alexander Leon and Martin Cooney are central to neonatal care as we know it. They operated, as we've heard, simultaneously as sites of entertainment, public health education, and very successful infant care wards with staggering success rates, really. And so in tracing and bringing together all of these multiple operations, Elizabeth really artfully shows us the importance of attending to fields of practice and directional routes of circulation outside the settled operation of medical expertise. This tale to me amends and it also complicates, it disrupts a more familiar story of 20th century biomedicalisation as that of institutionalised medical expertise, expanding kind of hungrily from those centres to incorporate ever more fields and lay subjects. While the reshaping of birth towards institutionalised hospital settings and away from women's self-management is part of this story and is a familiar story, the constitution of expertise here is really patchwork. It's bootlegged in the case of the two entrepreneurs' credentials. And it also incorporates modes of experimentation and I think modes of witness outside that of the rarefied lab-based scientific method on which appeals to biomedical authority so often rest. Through very meticulous historical research, Elizabeth has assembled for us a story that's previously fallen outside the dominant history of neonatal care, precisely because it takes place in these sites of amusement and exhibition, and they have less focused and less sanctified and less protected attendant archives. Elizabeth's paper also contributes to what I see as the history of reproduction as a history of artifice. I've been thinking a lot about artifice lately as a central channel through which contemporary social relations of kinship, of labour and of difference are being organised and reshaped. And as we've heard, the Incubator's Elizabeth documents were referred often in the media coverage and hype, and also by the inventors themselves, often referred to through notions of artificiality, the titular artificial mother on display. So these artificial mothers of wood and of glass join a range of other figures of artifice, mimesis and doubling in the history of reproductive technoscience. The IVF embryo in glass that both is and is not like the unseen embryo in the uterus, the synthetic blastoid embryo created in a Monash University lab in 2021 for research use, that sparked kind of revision of recommendations around governance for embryos, for embryo use in science. One of my favourites, the silicon pregnancy belly that can be purchased and worn by intending mothers who have contracted surrogates to carry and birth their babies so they can have the appearance or experience of that body shape. Or the sperm donor catalogue, which is organised by ethnic and phenotypic categories, and it purports to only describe, but it in fact makes material, the fiction of race. So while reproductive technoscience is often analysed in feminist work through lenses of pronatalism, genealogical grids, and all of the disappointments of heteronormative kinship, These artificial forms, I think, dramatize how it's also a field of horizontal replication and of mimicry. It has a recursive logic, to use Sarah Franklin's terminology, and this recursion allows us to view kinship and its stratified relations anew. Centering artifice directs us, I think, to the illusory gap between the real and the technologized up, a gap that is central to the distribution of gendered and racial oppression, of who and of or what is ordained as natural. And I think that studying this gap is instructive for our efforts to think against naturalization, but in cahoots with nature, which is one of my personal definitions of feminist STS as a political project. So in Elizabeth's wonderful analysis of incubators, mimicry, here mimicry of a mother, is central to how the technologies were pitched to the publics. And I want to revisit a 1897 article from The Lancet that you cite and that you mentioned in your talk, which says that the incubator requires, and I quote, no constant and skilled care. It works automatically. Both ventilation and heat are maintained without any fluctuations whatsoever. The only attendance necessary is that needed for feeding and washing the infants. So from our present vantage, it's hard not to see here a very familiar fantasy of automation as the silver bullet for the woes of tedious labour, typified so often by the gendered drudgery of social reproduction. And the artificial emerges here in the tenor of optimisation. This fantasy of optimised maternity obscures, as Elizabeth has discussed, the way that care for children always still depends on gendered labour, even as the real or the biological mother is supposedly left in the dust. And one of the many things I really love about the article, the broader article from which this talk draws, is the way that you keep in view at all times the nurses who were central to operating incubators and to staffing the exhibits, including Cooney's wife, Annabelle Mayo, who he met when she was a nurse on Coney Island and then went on to run the exhibit. And in doing so, I think you so beautifully ground techno-liberalist fantasies of automation, or what Irina Aristikova calls ectogenetic desires, in the materiality of social reproduction. The nurse haunts fantasies of external gestation as a way to supposedly solve the gendered oppression that supposedly originates in reproductive capacities. And really highlights how gender endures always not as an essentialist biological formation, not as a formation of reproductivity, but as a technology for distributing intimacy and the labour of maintenance and the labour of care. And while reading your article, I also couldn't shake from my mind a resonant contemporary image of ectogenetic desire, the biobag, which I'm sure you've seen and which others might have seen, which is a partial artificial womb technology successfully trialled in Philadelphia in 2017 with lamb fetuses, many resonances between the lamb and the chicken. And it was successfully trialled at the equivalent of, with lambs at the equivalent of 22 to 24 weeks gestation. And it was later charmingly dubbed Eve by Australian scientists who replicated the experiment. So the biobag represents one of the latest spectacles in a long history of speculation across both biomedical research and amusement settings, and also feminist cultural production and fantasies about the artificial womb as a way to solve persistent gendered and heteronormative oppression. In making sense of the incubators and the gendered kinship relations and the national fantasies they also distill, Elizabeth directs us and directs this sustained granular attention to the constitutive role of imperialism and racialised population governance. And I'm particularly grateful as well for this part of the work, because I think that often falls out of some of the feminist work on reproduction. Imperial projects are always foremost reproductive ones. And I wonder about how the racialised reproduction of colonised peoples as surplus in the US and French colonies and territories at the time also kind of haunts this story as the constitutive outside. So Elizabeth shows us how this contrasting reception of incubators in France and the US must be understood through contrasting regimes and anxieties around population futures. In the late 19th century France, where depopulation fears abounded, the incubator visualised the proliferation of soldiers, as we've heard, and was quickly integrated into hospital use. And in the US, by contrast, a prevailing anxiety around degeneration propelled a less welcome reception and a more acrimonious relationship between Cooney's public exhibits and the medical establishment. As fears circulated about a drop not in overall numbers, but the quality of population, the visual display of premature infants risked calling to mind feeble, imperiled national futures. And similarly, I think we might draw from those threads to think about the contemporary biobag of silicon and sterile laboratories as a fantasy that's constituted and only thinkable through wealthy nations mounting anxieties around depopulation, the fascistic clamour of white decline from everywhere, and also post-genomic insights into the ways non-human actors, from microplastics to methylmercury to bushfire smoke, are all reshaping the materiality of human gestation and making it uncontrollable in different ways. Okay, I could talk about this work for much longer, for the whole day, but I think I'm pretty much out of time. So I just want to wrap up with one question for you, Elizabeth, in the interests of continuing this conversation. In doing feminist work on reproduction and technologised birth and capitalism's kind of hungry extractive relations, I often feel the temptation, at times a guilty one, when I scrub out, to reach for the biological mother and her synecdoches, flesh, corporeality, interrelation, intimacy, as grounds for critique, and especially in the face of a kind of tsunami of the machinic and the automated as these supposed solutions. And yet, of course, in like the perils of reaching blithely for the organic as a salve is perhaps the foundational axiom of feminist STS, right? So I'm really interested in how you tread this line, which I think you so artfully do, in telling the history of the incubator, between holding critically the risks of a discourse like the artificial optimized mother, but also not slipping into valorizing reproduction prior to this tech as somehow unassisted. And another way of phrasing this is to ask, how do you, as a feminist scholar, approach doing nature culture's work in this genre of such meticulous, granular historical research?
Thank you so much, Jaya, for that thoughtful response. I'll invite Elizabeth and Jaya back up to the stage and we'll open up for questions in just a minute when I get a microphone for us.
Did you sort of
Okay.
Okay, so we'll have Sophie with a microphone roaming around, and maybe if you're asking a question, just briefly introduce yourself first. But first, Elizabeth, do you want to respond to the question that Jaya posed in her?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jaya. And guys, thanks to the organisers of the conference for setting up this, this thing of having a dialogue as well. I'm such a fan of Jaya's book, Making Gabies. If you haven't read it, you need to put it on your reading list immediately. And so it's such a privilege to have your thoughts on my paper as well. And you asked a really interesting question at the end, which is where I think about how I think about the natural in relation to this, thinking through this in the frame of as a feminist scholar. And I think I'm a little bit more hesitant around the category of the natural itself. It's not one that I turn to. My previous book was on the idea of normalization, and the normal and the natural have a complicated history together. So I tend to be a little bit wary of the idea, of the natural as well. It tends to be when people turn away from frameworks like normalization, they often turn to the natural as a naturalized category to think about these things. So I tend to be a little jumpy about the idea of the natural itself. So it's a challenging question for me to think about, because I think I tend to think of you talked so beautifully about the role of artifice and queerness. Thank you so much for doing that. I really appreciate you drawing out that thread. And I think of the natural as a category within the idea of the artificial, that for me it's a subcategory of that. So that's an unpacking of your question rather than an answer, but it's given me a lot to think about. Thank you.
So we've just got a few minutes for questions. Yes, perhaps Over here.
Hi. Thank you so much.
Can you go to-
Oh, sorry.
Thanks so much for both of these presentations. They were amazing. I'm Fiona Druitt from the University of Melbourne, and I wanted to just actually maybe respond to Jaya's question by using your paper, because I found it particularly inspiring. So I wondered if you'd thought about the way that in the natural, so in the sort of medicalised adoption of the incubator, which has a pretty fraught and very interesting history and a strange history, in the way that the question of spectatorship comes up in the middle, and you talked about visual cultures. So by spectatorship, I mean seeing the gaze. And this problem of spectatorship is a modern paradox that kind of runs like through French philosophy, I guess, from Sartre through Lacan to Merleau-Ponty. And then on the other hand, in the materiality of the incubator, so in the shows, which I mean like embodying the body of the incubator, the question of spectatorship sort of comes into the middle of that. So is that a way of sort of differentiating, I guess, nature? Like, so have you thought of it in that sort of way where this question of spectatorship comes up in the middle of this category of nature or materiality?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the natural, like the question of spectatorship and the natural is kind of the question that is at the heart of the way that spectatorship and the spectacle is framed in the rhetoric of the time as well. So the question that people ask about the displays in the end of the 19th century and through to sort of the 1930s is precisely what the status of the natural is in relation to the spectacle that people are seeing. And there's a lot of discussion about whether, obviously this is a shorter version, of the chapter, so stuff like Cooney's wife, Annabelle Mayo, gets cut out of the story in the version that I gave. Now, a lot to say about the role of the nurses as well. Like, I don't know, because I had to go through the slides quite quickly, but in the Lyon exhibition, there are black nurses as well, which you do not see in the USA. So much to say about that as well. But the question of the way that spectacularized gets discussed in the rhetoric of the time is precisely about where the status of the babies in terms of categories of naturalness in the time. And there's a lot of rhetoric around the extent to which the incubator itself has reformed the babies as being inherently machinic themselves and inherently artificial. So these categories that we use are so dynamic in this period as well. And so it's fascinating because they're not used in naturalized ways, if I can say it like that. They're actually being problematized by and reconfigured through the intersection between so there are different ways that people talk about what it means to be a spectator in these and what it is that people are spectating as well, because there are different, the babies are differentiated as well, so that in France, there are babies from different ethnic backgrounds that you don't see in the Coney Island exhibitions as well. It becomes much more homogenous. There are a couple of examples, because he was in other sites of exhibition as well, where there are exoticized babies, and I chose not to show those images, but there are very few of those. So what's fascinating is that those relationships are actively reformulated through those spaces rather than being stable categories that you can use to analyse those spaces. Great question.
I think we have one online.
Yes, we do. From Astrid Lorange, and I'm just going with the French pronunciation given all the French, but that may be incorrect. She's from the School of Art and Design, University of New South Wales. And the question is that they're interested in what you say about the maternal body as noise. What were the anxieties about and desires to transcend maternal noise?
Yeah, the anxieties about the female body, it's interesting because the rhetoric is around, as you say, the automation and the artificiality, but the rhetoric is that, and this is common rhetoric that you see in lots of places about bodies, you know, in the 1900s. The rhetoric is around what happens to the human body in spaces of urbanisation and automation. And there is so much rhetoric around, there's a lot of rhetoric around gender. So it happens in terms of masculinity as well, that male bodies become weak and liquidy, you know, in urban environments because they sleep on soft feather beds and, you know, so on. And then the opposite rhetoric around, you know, that with women is that they've become, you know, they're enfeebled, their naturalness, you know, has been undermined by the artificial conditions of urban life, you know, in American big cities. It's a time of, you know, it's later in the US, it's really the early first half of the 20th century where you get this sort of mass, you know, urbanisation as well. And so that's how the female body becomes the noise, like it's the failing female body, the fleshy, you know, body that is unable to maintain itself within and to kind of adhere to its natural function, you know. And this is, of course, the rhetoric that you see in Germany, you know, at the same time as well, that there's a lot of that kind of return to nature and women should have lots of babies and live in the countryside and so on. It's the other side of that rhetoric. And in this context, the women have become this kind of hindrance to the needed, you know, in the American context, eugenic population process. And so it's their very fleshiness that becomes the noise in the machine, and it's the machine that runs smoothly. Not what was actually happening, but that's...
I think we've got one question in the back here and one here, and then we probably need to wind it up. Yeah.
Hey, Paul McGee, University of Canberra. Fantastic paper, Elizabeth. I was thinking about the opposition between the hospital space and the exhibition space, because it's striking me that in their function as training institutions, hospitals are constantly staging exhibitions in the sense that the head doctor will walk around with all the students accompanying them and will exhibit particular patients. And actually the nature of it too is that they exhibit to the students patients who are particularly strange or, you know, abnormal in some way, because that's the most interesting pedagogically. So I was just wondering about that opposition between exhibition space and hospital and, you know, how strong it is.
Yeah, really good question. And of course, you're absolutely right. There's a long history of exhibiting bodies, unusual bodies within the spaces of hospitals as well. One of the kind of fascinating historical tidbits about this is that that design of, I mean, obviously there's kind of practical reasons as well, of maximising the visibility for spectators of babies is the design that was used when maternity wards were established in hospitals. So anyone who's seen one, my knowledge of all this is rather bookish, I should say, having not reproduced myself, but maternity wards do have big windows at the front. You know, they do. The incubators are set up so that people, you know, today, so that people can see them. So in fact, when neonatal wards were established in hospitals, they use the same design as this as well, which is continuous with what you're saying. Around the hospitals being, you know, sites of spectacularisation, that there is that, of course, but there's also the politics of who gets to be in hospitals and who gets treated in hospitals as well. And so then that's when you start to have divergent histories as well. And so the a spectacularisation of normalisation in that context was one that was not happening. There is, like, you know, institutional differences in hospitals as well. So, you know, incubators, if you're wondering, were integrated into Australia and the UK before they were in the US, for instance, but we have completely different hospital systems as well. So there's multiple things to think about in terms of the institution of the hospital. But yeah, you're right that they are sites of spectacularisation too.
Okay, yeah, one last question.
Just a couple, actually. One's really small, which is, do you know to what extent the incubators themselves sort of dampened the noise of the infants? So that's my first question. And the second question is, do you have any, or have you done any research on the UK response, medical response, given the really vigorous exchange between eugenics societies in the UK and the US? You know, I mean, basically they're feeding each other. And just wondering if there's a kind of similarity there?
Yeah, great questions. I'm going to do the eugenics one, and then you'll have to remind me what the first one was. But the eugenics one is, yes. So for anyone who doesn't know, eugenics is invented in the early 20th century by Francis Galton, cousin of Charles Darwin. He's the guy who invents the term eugenics, but he invents what we would call positive eugenics. So he's not so much into, the killing of people or letting people die. And when eugenics then comes directly from Galton's work, Harry Laughlin, who I mentioned, one of the main people who introduces it into the United States. And it's then that it changes into what we think of as eugenics today. And it's the Americans that influence the Germans. So there's a direct line from the US and from the New York and Cold Springs Harbour to Germany in the 1930s, and it's not through the UK, actually. So there is a slightly divergent history there. It's hard to say something kind of, defending the British eugenicists, but they are quite distinct histories. Oh, and the noise of the... I know, I always but historically they are different. But the noise of the babies, that's such an interesting question. One of the reasons that when they tried to use the incubators in hospitals, that the mortality rate was a lot higher was they left the babies inside the incubators, and getting the amount of oxygen right in them, a lot of the babies went blind. It was one of the reasons that they didn't use them. But Coney thought that was actually not nice for the babies to not have any comfort of a flesh body. And so he had a kind of a policy that the baby should be taken out a lot and that they needed to be cuddled. He was the only, none of the doctors were saying this at the time, but he believed that cuddling was important for the babies. And that was actually one of the reasons that the success rate was so high, was that he took them out. But, no one mentions, there's a lot of spectacularization about how small the babies are. So the nurses would take them out of the incubators and show them to the public at Coney Island. And the nurses would do things like take the ring off their finger and put it over the wrist of the baby, like a bracelet, to show, and this is a classic sideshow, thing that you would do, to show how small they were. But no one ever talks about the babies yelling, which babies are wont to do. But they were allowed out a lot more than they were in the hospitals, which was a contributing factor.
We're going to have to wrap up there because we have our next session starting at 11:15, I think. Yep. So we have time to get a quick cup of tea or coffee before the next session. But please join me in thanking Elizabeth and Jaya. Sorry, the next session is the tours for the making and doing. Starting in the immersive space.
Yeah, first, well done.
Only if, yeah, we'll talk about it. But I am serious, but only if it works with.